Hey everyone, Tim Clapham here for week 9 of the c4d215 course here on FXPhD, and we're going to continue with the project that we started last week. You can see that I've got the scene open here. What we're going to do this week is we're going to add in a lot of the animation. Now, to save time this week, I have included a couple of Cinema 4D scene files with the download. So first of all, we need to open those up, and one of them contains a couple of splines and the other one contains a bunch of objects that we're going to be using for our toys. Now, they're fairly simple, but let's open those files and have a look at what we've got. So here is the first file with 2 splines. We've got this path up, path down, and we're going to use these so that we have a spline to attach all our objects to. So first of all, let's just take both of these and copy those. Let's close that down and let's paste them into our existing scene. If we come to our front view and paste them, and they should line up. And I'm just going to hide the splines that we already have in this scene, because we don't need to see those. The other scene, which I just skipped past, is here, which is toys. Actually, they're all hidden at the moment, and the reason for that is because there's 2 of every toy. So what I've done is I've saved quite a bit of time. For instance, here we've got a soccer ball, and if we come in and have a look at that. Now, this is just like a representation of what would happen in a lot of real jobs, especially if you're going to be buying stock models and things like that, because a lot of the time you can just go and buy a model and it's an economical route rather than spending time paying a modeler, which may take a couple of days to build a model, and you can buy it for $100 or something like that. And the problem is, however, that most of the time they are like crappy mesh like this. I mean, the mesh is, you know, it's okay, but there's not really a lot we can do with it. We could spend time trying to clean it up. And this isn't a particularly bad mesh, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen that. You know, people model things using subdivision surfaces, but then they don't give you the low-res cage. They collapse it all, they make it editable, and when you buy the model, it looks great in the thumbnails, but it's really high-res, and you end up with a lot of polygons in your scene that if you'd have built all those models yourself, you wouldn't necessarily have. So here we have this soccer ball. If we choose objects, object information, you can see that we've got 3,500 polygons. So what I've done is just create a simple proxy, which is a sphere. And there you go, and you can see that's fairly low res, and if we check the object information of that, you can see that we have like 80 polygons. So we've gone from 80 to 3,500, and if we had 10 of those, obviously that's a big difference in the amount of polygon count in the whole scene. And that's what all of these objects are. So we've got like this really, a lot of them are very simple. I've made them really quickly because, obviously I don't have time to model lots of toys, and I can't give away stock models. But hopefully they will be good enough to complete this project, and if it was a real job you wanted to take it further, then obviously you can use any models of your own. So here's our spaceship, and there's our proxy, and you can see they're very low res, made up of just a couple of simple polygon objects to keep that polygon count as low as possible. And a lot of these models that I've made are pretty low res anyway, but if you were working with like high res objects, then this would definitely be a way to kind of speed up workflow. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these and we're going to build a little espresso rig so we can switch between the proxy and the high-res version nice and easily. The other thing you'll notice is that I've created textures for all of these objects and drop them onto them. It just saves time for the class. You don't have to create the selection sets. You don't need to drag all the materials on. They're very simple at the moment. We will be changing those later, but we can just work on the materials at that point and it will update on our objects, and that's just going to save us a bit of time as well. So let's just grab all of these objects and copy them. We can close this and paste these into our working file. Let's add in a null, and I'm going to call this scene. I'm going to store all my scene elements here. And then I'm going to add another null as a child for this, and I'm going to call this instance originals, if I can just spell correctly. Okay, and then I'm going to place all of these objects that I've just pasted into that instance originals. Let's just drop this at the bottom, fold up that pipework, bring up my layers. Okay, and I seem to have two toys layers. Let's just get rid of this one, and let's just grab this scene hierarchy, hold down Control, drop it onto that scene layer. So what I want to do here is I'm going to use instances, and we can use the instance to switch between these two objects. So let's just come up and add an instance object, and let's right click, choose tags, and add an Espresso tag, and this will open up your Espresso window. So what we want to do here is we want to create a switch so that we can switch our instances between the high and the low res versions, and it's really simple to do. The way that we're going to do that is, first of all, we're going to add some user data. Select your instance, choose user data, add user data. We can add a group here, and let's call this group proxy. Okay, and let's drag this data in here. Now this data, we can call this high res, and the data type for this is going to be a link. And then we can add some more data here, and let's call this low res, and this is a link as well, and click OK. And you can see now on the instance we've got this new tab, user data, proxy, low, high res. And actually what I want to do is come back in and grab this group, and if we just grab it and drag it out of the user data like so, it then becomes a tab. So we've got this proxy tab. If we grab this instance and let's drag that into our Espresso, and then come down and we have our proxy, and we can output our low res, and then we can output our high res. And what we need to do is we need to create a switch so that the output from this then links back into the same object, but this time what we're going to do is we're going to link it into the actual reference object field here, and whatever object's here is the instance, it's the object it's referencing, and it's the object that the instance displays. So for here we need to choose object properties, reference object, and input that into here. But of course we can't link both of these objects into one input. We need to actually add a switch of some kind, and we can do that using a condition node. So we choose new node, Espresso, logic, condition. Now the condition nodes allows you to add more inputs, and then it allows you to create a switch. So that switch by default is only going to switch between these two inputs, so you need to input a 0 or a 1. But you can add more, and depending on the value that you input, it will choose the different outputs. But we only need 2 here anyway. Next, we simply drag our low-res link onto our condition, and you can see that it's not letting us do that. And the reason for that is because we haven't set the data type to be the correct type. So if we select this condition node in our Espresso attribute manager, we choose data type and we change that to link. Now we should be able to connect those up. So we drag our low and our high res to our 2 different inputs, and we take our output and we drag that onto the instance. So what that means is if we take this instance and we switch to the proxy tab and we put our present proxy 01 as a low, and we put our present high res in the second one, that instance now links to those 2 objects. Of course these are all hidden, so if we just control click on the parent we can unhide all of those. And what I want to do is hide that actual instant originals null, because you can't hide the object itself if you're using it in an instance, because it will hide in the instance. So you have to put them inside a null, and if we hide that null but leave the actual objects themselves visible, then we don't see those, we only see the actual instance, and there it is. And you can see it's a very detailed object of a present. But if we come to our condition here and we change this to 1, you can see it then switches to this much higher res version. So we've got a lot more geometry on there. So we need to create a more convenient way of switching this, and what we can do is we can place either this on the instance object itself, or we can place it somewhere else in the scene. So what I want to do is I'm going to place it on this instance originals null here, and then I can create one switch that will switch all of my instances regardless of where they are in the scene. So with this instance originals null selected, choose user data, add user data, and then let's just call this switch proxy, and we're going to set that as a bool, so it has a checkbox, and we just click OK. Now we can drag this into here, we can output our user data switch proxy, and we can link that into the switch. So now, if we select this, we can switch the proxy for that object. The other thing that I want to do here is just have it so that the name updates automatically, so we know what the object is. So if we just drag this in for a moment, add our object input, and then here I'm going to choose basic properties name. Now if we take our high-res object and link that into here, it's going to take that high-res and output the name of that object. We can then take the same instance and we can input that into the name. So we choose basic properties name. But before we do that, I just want to add on to it the word instance, so we know that it is an instance. We can see that from the icon, but if we were looking at it maybe in the timeline or referencing it some other way, then it's probably good to have an accurate name on there. And we can do that simply by choosing new node, Espresso, calculate, maths, and we're going to do a simple add, but the data type that we're going to use here is a string. So we take our name, put that as the first input, and for the second input I'm just going to put underscore instance, and then we can link that to the name of our object, and you can see that our object automatically updates, and we can see that the name that it takes is based on the high-res object. Okay, there's only one other thing I want to do before we move on, just to make this a bit more flexible. At the moment all of these nodes are linking to an absolute object. By the way, you can hold down Control and click on this menu bar, or the title bar, sorry, and it will optimize that node so you can see everything in there. But if we select these, you can see they're all set to absolute reference, so it means they're referencing this object, and if we copy this Espresso tag onto another object, they're still going to reference this particular object. But what we want to do is we want to use a relative reference so that the object that's referenced in these nodes is the object that the tag is on. And that means we can take that tag and put it on lots of other objects, and it will then automatically update to the object that's holding the tag, rather than reference this instance up here. So if we select these object nodes and we change the reference to relative reference, and it's using this object, then that will do that. So now if we take this and we create a duplicate, we can now drag in our other objects, and you can see this updates correctly. So I'm just going to do this for each one. So we've got the biplane and then the biplane high res, and you can see the name updating each time. These aren't necessarily in the correct order, but all the proxies are called proxy. And once we've done this, we're good to go, and we can dupe these instances every time we need them. And then if we need to update any other objects, we can just update the reference here, and they'll update accordingly. Okay, so one more to do. I mean, there's not a lot of objects that I've picked here. It would probably look much better if we had loads more objects, so that there were so many unique objects. But obviously it's not a real world project, I didn't have time to make all of those for you guys. But if you've got other objects that you want to use, then by all means go ahead and do it. Especially if you've got some really high res objects and you can make some low res proxies, it will give you a really good indication of the kind of speed difference that you're going to get. Okay, so there we go. So there are all of our proxies in place. We should be able to select this and switch proxy, and you can see they're all updating. Obviously they're all in the same place, but you get the idea. Cool stuff. So that is all working. So at this point I'm going to just save my project. So those of you who follow the HelloLux blog that I run at hellolux.com might be familiar with this instance setup, because there is an article on there about it. So apologies if you've seen it before, but it's definitely worth repeating for those of you that haven't, because it's a handy little trick. And the other thing here is obviously we're using relative references in our nodes, which makes them pretty versatile if we want to move them from one object to another. So that's a very handy feature. Now, of course, there are other ways of approaching this. You could use an XREF object, which has a proxy built into it, and that's certainly a viable solution. The only thing with XREFs is that I found they can be a little bit slow on opening and saving scenes, especially if you've got a lot of them and they're quite complex. But yeah, give it a try. I've certainly used XREFs like that, but what I tend to do is instance the XREFs if I don't need to animate the individual elements of them, and use a very similar setup to this and have all my XREFs down here and then create instances for them. But the XREFs themselves have an option for proxies. Okay, so next thing is to get these toys animating around the shape, and I want to do that with a cloner object, so it's a fairly simple setup, and there's a few ways we could do that. First of all, let's just get this pipework and select the actual pipework subdivision surfaces, and if we switch to the basic tab, we can just enable X-ray mode, and that means we can see what's inside, which will be a lot more useful than not being able to see what we're doing. I'm going to add in a null, just call this toys. Okay, and let's just grab all of these and drop them into this toys null. With that null selected, let's hold down Shift, come to MoGraph and add in a cloner. And let's call this cloner toys up. Next, take all of the toy instance objects and drop them into the cloner. And this is quite important. We need to grab these two presents, which are our kind of GIFs. What I want is the GIFs to appear at the end here. So we want these 5 toys to be traveling around, and then as it comes out here, I want the presents to appear. So I'm going to place those presents at the bottom of the hierarchy as children of this cloner. Switch to the object tab, and there's a couple of ways we could approach this. We could use like a spline effector to attach them to the spline, or we can just switch the mode to object and then link our path up into the object field. And let's just put these two splines at the very top here so they come before the cloner, because we're going to be cloning onto those splines, so it's probably best to have them evaluated first. Now the count is set to 10. I'm going to want quite a few more than that, so let's set that up to say 60. And as you can see, the distribution is not very good at the moment. We've got something down here and then nothing until this point. So what we want to do is set the distribution to be either step, where we can specify the distance, or where it's even. So there's an even distribution along our spline. And then we can grab our offset and we can move all of those objects around. So pretty simple MoGraph stuff at the moment. Now, as far as the animation goes, it's a fairly long path for something to travel along, and if we were going to travel along that in say 5 seconds, then the objects are going to have to move pretty fast. So what I think is a better approach for a project like this is to set your project to be even longer, let's say 1,000 frames all in, and animate along that full duration. And then when we set up some cameras, we can pick certain moments along the timeline, and we can end up with just a few very short clips and cut together like a 10 or 15 second ID from that, and it allows you to kind of run your MoGraph setup, find the best looking parts, set up some cameras for those, and you don't have to worry about fitting it all in. So even though you may be trying to create a piece of work that's only 10-15 seconds long, there's no problem with doing this. You're not going to render all those frames out, although you might do as a hardware preview so that you can then cut together your spot in some editing package, and then you would probably output the frame ranges with a little bit of handles on them just to complete the project. On frame 0, what I want to do here is I want to set the offset at 0, and then I'm going to animate this. But I want it so that I can't see any of these toys at the beginning. I want them off the or down here, out of view. We can do that using these start and end parameters, but of course that's going to squash everything up. You can see everything gets really squashed, and we don't really want that either. So I'm going to set the end to be 50, and leave the offset at 0. And then instead of adjusting the parameters on here, let's grab our path, and I'm going to grab path up and down because they're both the same more or less. The only difference is the down one goes down here and the up one goes up here. And let's switch to points mode. Uncheck only select visible elements, and let's select this bottom point. And now if I come to my view here, in fact let's do it from here, you can see that as I make that spline longer, I can pull these down. So they're just sort of out the bottom of that last tubing. So select the cloner toys up. Let's add a key for offset at 0 on frame 0, and let's add a key for our end at 50 on frame 0, and let's jump to the very end. And we probably don't want to offset it too much. I'm going to set the end parameter back to 100, so we have our distribution. And the offset, I'm going to just try a value of around 20 for now, and add a key for that. Now of course, if we come to our timeline, we have a look at these, press H in our F curve, you can see that they're easing. So I'm just going to choose Alt L to make those linear. And now if we come back and press play, you can see they're traveling at quite a nice speed. Maybe they could be a little bit faster. Perhaps we could set this offset to maybe 30. Obviously it's quite boring just watching this, but we can focus on, you know, you can bring your camera in and just be focusing on this part here at the beginning, so you can see them come on, and you know, as this hits them, they can be focusing on a different part. So you've got some interesting compositions that you could make as these elements pass by. Now to make it even more interesting, I think we could add some dynamics. We could make these so they move at slightly different speeds, so they interact with each other. And also we've got the cloner toys down, and that's going to be traveling at the same time, so we're going to have twice as many in there. Okay, let's just rewind. Next thing to look at is how these toys are distributed. So scrub through, let's just come in and have a quick look. You can see that the cloner is obviously set to iterate, that's the default, so we're just iterating through each of these. And we've got our presents visible here as well, and we don't want those presents to be visible until we're going through this opaque section where they're going to change. So what we can do is we can use the sort mode on our cloner, just as we did with the pipes, to place the T pipe at a certain position. If we do that with the cloner and we change that to sort, you can see that they all take on the first child. If we then add, say for instance, a plane effector, we can then use the modify clone parameter, and as we scrub through that, you can see it picks each child in turn until we get to the last two. So I'm not going to do this with a plane effector, I want to do it with a random effector. That's just a simple way to demonstrate it. If you think, how many have we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So if we grab a calculator here and we say 100% divided by 7 equals 14.28, and we only want to show the first 5, so if we times that by 5, you can see that we've got 71.42. Okay, so let's select this cloner, remember that value, let's add in a random effector. Okay, this random toys, and I'm going to switch off position. And what we want to do here is we want to modify the clone. And if you can see all of those, taking the first one, as we increase the modified clone parameter, it's going to randomly pick from the children. So let's set that to 100. Like so. And you can see now it's picking some of the presents because we only want that value to go up to 71.42, but we can do that up here, minimum max. And what we want to do is we want to set our minimum to be 0, and we want to set our maximum to be, say, 72. It probably should be 71.4, but let's just try 72 for now. And then we can just randomly change the seed until we're kind of happy with what we've got. And we've only got 5 there, so you're going to get repeating. But let's now creating these random toys from that hierarchy. Let's just grab this and put that underneath. Let's select that cloner again, choose MoGraph Effector and choose Random. And let's call this Random Presence and put this down under here. I'm going to disable position. I'm going to set Modify Clone to be 100 again. You can see it's randomizing all of these. Let's set our maximum and minimum to 0 and our maximum to 100. So that's now picking the full range. So it's kind of avoided this first random effect. But what we want this presence one to do is to only pick these last 2. Now you could have a whole bunch of presents in there, and you just do the maths depending on how many objects you have as children. We've got 2 there. So what we want to do here is we want to set our in fact, on this toys one, I think we should set our maximum to 71, and then our presence we should set our minimum to 72. And there you go. And you can see as soon as we do that, it's only picking a random from these last 2 elements. If we had 10, it would probably be easier to calculate because it would be a 10% for each one, but because we had 7, that's the way it works. So if we come around here, you can see that traveling up. So what we need to do with this random presence is we just need to add in some fall off. So let's just set that fall off to be linear, and we want the direction to be along x, minus x. And if we come to our front view, let's just set that to ice palms. If we drag this over here, and we can just set that to say 10 on x. That means any of these clones that pass this side will become the presents, but any that don't won't be affected by that. So now you can see we have all of these random presents, toys. As they get to this point, they turn into presents. Pretty cool. And of course, we can at any point come down and just check that out with our high-res version. Okay, so we can select this and hide the fall-off. Now obviously everything is very uniform, the spacing between all of these. Now I'm going to add some dynamics a little bit later, so they will interact with each other, and it will become a little bit more interesting. They'll be tumbling and everything will look a bit better, but I want to try and improve that before we even think about dynamics. So what I want to do is perhaps adjust the speed of these or adjust the spacing. There's a couple of ways to do that. You can select the cloner itself. We've got this offset variation, so we could set that to say 25. And you can see that what happens is that some of them move faster than others, which is quite a nice feature, especially if we've got dynamics, because they won't pass through each other as they are now. They'll hit each other, and then you'll get some nice tumbling and interaction going on. The only problem with using the offset variation is as we get further and further in time, it kind of the variation increases. We're not going too high with an offset value, but if I keep going, you can see that, maybe you can't see it, but you get like clumping of objects and you get bigger gaps and stuff like that because the variation parameter seems to increase, or the effect of it increases over time. But we can still use that. Let's just set that to be, say, 10, so it's not too high. Let's just have a look. So you don't really notice the variation at the very beginning here. They're all very evenly spaced, but when we get to a point later on, you can see the variation is much greater. So the other thing that I want to do is add in some randomness to their movement. So let's select the cloner here, choose MoGraph Effector, Random Effector, and let's call this Random PZ. Because they're moving along a spline, the clones themselves are going to be oriented along their Z axis, so we can adjust that Z position using this random effector. And if we use an animated noise, then they're going to move backwards and forwards as they're moving forward. So they're going to kind of slow down and speed up, and it's going to make everything look a little bit funky. And you know, I don't want this to look like a smooth running toy distribution. I want it to be kind of a bit wacky and not really work very well. So this hopefully is a fairly good solution. So what I'm going to do first of all is switch to the effector tab, Let's set the random mode to be noise. Okay, and let's just slow that speed down to about 50. Switch to the parameter tab, and I'm going to set the X and Y positions to be 0, and let's set the Z to be, say, 150. And now if we press play, you can see you get this funky movement as they kind of move backwards and forwards, which looks a bit odd because everything's very linear at the moment, and we are working without the dynamics. But once we add in dynamics, hopefully, and we've got twice as many toys, there's going to be a lot of interaction because of this, and it should make for a much more interesting animation. The other thing as well is, if you notice, I think these biplanes are a bit too big, and also this beach ball is quite big. So let's just come down to our instance originals and select our biplane. Now the important thing here, and I didn't mention this when making the proxy, is that the proxy and the biplane have to have their axes in exactly the same place and orientation. If they don't, then they're not going to be a true representation of each other. So if we're going to scale it, we need to scale both. So there we go. Look, I can just scale that biplane down as it plays. And I think also I'm going to scale this beach ball down a little bit because it just seems a little bit too big. And the other thing are these presents. They look a bit small. Let's come to the end here. So let's scale those up. Something like so. Now, of course, we're getting a lot of intersecting and stuff like that because of this crazy random backwards and forwards effect. The dynamics should solve that. So let's come up to our cloner, right click and choose simulation tags, rigid body. Now if we just press play, all of those objects are just going to drop down. If we just come out here, they're all our objects. Gravity's taking over, they're just dropping down. Now we don't want that to happen. We do want the effect of gravity, but what we really want to do is we want to maintain their position, and we can do that under the force tab. We've got follow position and follow rotation. I'm not really interested in the following rotation, and follow position I'm going to set fairly low. We could set this up to say 100, and now when we press play, you can see they didn't really move there. So the reason for that is because the cloner object itself has one dynamics tag, and this tag is looking at all the children, but it's treating them as one object at the moment. So we need to come to the collision tab, and where we have this individual elements, it's currently set to off, so it's treating this as one large dynamic object. But if we set this to top level and press play, you can now see what's happening. So we're getting this weird effect where they're trying to follow position. It's so high, they're trying to maintain, but they're hitting each other, so it's definitely not the result that we want. So if we come back to this tag and we set that follow position to be much lower, so they try and maintain position, but you know, there's a bit of give and take. If we set that to say 5, hopefully now when we press play, you can see that the motion looks a lot nicer. They're trying to reach that position, but if they hit another object, they're not struggling and being forced into that position. They just kind of look a little bit more organic, and you can see already it's looking, the motion is looking a lot nicer. Now of course we've got the problem with the intersections of the actual tubes themselves. I think this spaceship object is looking a bit big. It's going to cause problems and maybe cause some blockages, so let's select both of those as well and just scale those down a little bit, something like so. And you can see that the motion looks really nice, but obviously it's passing through the tube itself. But that's not too much of a problem because this tube is obviously built using splines. And what we can do is we can come to our pipe work, and we've got these 3 pipes here, and we know that we have a radius of 80, so we should be able to create some geometry fairly quickly for that. In your scene you should have these splines still that we used last week. Let's just copy those into a new scene, paste them in. Let's unhide those. Okay. Now the T, maybe we should make these a bit longer. We're going to hide this object anyway that we make, so it doesn't matter too much. Now if we drop these into sweeps, and let's set let's add in a circle there. We set this to have, I will leave caps on for a moment. This I'm going to set to 75, so it's a little bit smaller than our tubes, which were 80. And let's just come in close and have a look. We've got far too much geometry there. We don't want all that. So I'm just going to set this to be, say, uniform, maybe 1. And there we go. So we've got a lot less geometry, but that's fine for our collision detection. Maybe set that to 2. Okay. And let's just duplicate this a couple of times. Swap the path for the other paths that we have. There we go. And now we should be able to, let's add in a bool. Grab our first 2, which are the straight parts. Drop those into that bool. And let's set that to A union B. Create single object. And let's just press C. And then we end up with this. And now what we can do is we can add in another bool. And we can drop both of these in. We set that to union again. Create single object. Don't really care too much about the quality of the topology, but what matters is the ends. So we have actually got caps on these, but I think you need the caps. Let's just go inside. There we go. That looks fine. So I'm just going to make that editable as well. So now we have this collider. We don't really need any of these tags on it. But what we do want to do is switch to our polygon mode and just select these caps and remove them. If we look down there, we should see a gap, yes. So it's just a matter of deleting these caps from each end. There we go, right. Now obviously this isn't parametric, and if anything changes, we'd have to remake this. You could perhaps do it using the bool and a connect object. Use the bool even as a collider with your spline objects in there. But it's probably going to slow things down a little bit too much, so I've just left it like that. We could have probably reduced the number of subdivisions around these curves as well, just to speed things up, but I think we'll be fine. So I'm just going to cut that from there, come back to my scene and paste that in. And let's just hide this and choose tags, simulation, and add a collider tag to this. Now if we press play now, you can see that we've got problems. Everything's avoiding it. The reason for that is because the type of collision that's set on the tag. So if we select the tag, come to collision, here we've got shape. It's currently set to automatic, so it's using a convex hull, but we're not going to animate this, so we can come down, we can just choose static mesh, and then everything should be okay. And now as they travel round, you can see that they don't pass through. And it's starting to be a little bit more interesting. I'm just going to come to this view here, and what I want to do is come in, and where I've got these path up and down, switch to points mode. I'm going to select both those points. I'm just going to pull that up so they travel up a bit higher. There we go. We can hide these splines. And let's rewind. Let's grab this toys hierarchy and just drop it onto that toys layer. And that collider as well can be part of that. and we can just put that into that hierarchy as well. So the whole thing's starting to take shape. Let's just save the scene. At the moment we have this huge collection of toys that travel all the way down like so. It's probably a good idea to hide those. So let's select our cloner toys up, choose mode graph effector, add in a plane effector, and let's call this plane visibility. There's two ways you can do this. You could either scale them or you can use the visibility checkbox. Let's just use the visibility checkbox. So I'm going to just check that. Now it doesn't actually have any effect on them, because what you need to do is switch to the effector tab and adjust the minimum maximum, and as long as the maximum is below 50 then it will work. So you can just set that to 50. Obviously we need some fall off here, so let's set that to linear, and I'm going to set that to be plus Y. And now as I come down you can see that they will become visible. So let's switch to our front view, and we can just set that to say 10 and drag this over here like so. Now as we press play you can see they just sort of pop on. Let's hide that visibility for now. Let's control drag to create a duplicate, and let's call this top, and this time I'm going to pull this up over here. So then as we get to the point here we should see them disappear up here, but of course what we need to do is change that fall off from plus Y to minus Y. There we go, and then we should see with this present, as it goes through it will just disappear. Okay, the spline must end in the wrong place there. Let's have a quick look. Let's pull this spline up past. Let's select path down, and we probably want to do the same here. Oh, that one is lower anyway. Let's just put it down a bit, just so they pass through that point before they jump back to the beginning. Hide these again, and grab these two effectors and drop these into the toys hierarchy and add them to the layer. So we've almost built this now. Let's just take this cloner toys up and duplicate it and call it cloner toys down. Now the only thing is, because they're using the exact same setup, they're going to look very similar. We do need to choose path down here, which is going to make them go down, but probably it's a good idea. Let's just juggle the order of these first 5 objects, just so that they're we don't see the same repeating pattern. And now if we come back here and rewind, you can see that we're getting quite a lot of objects. We're getting a little bit of hustle and bustle in there. At the moment there are obviously a lot of duplicates very similar to each other, but if we had more objects in there, it would make for a little bit more an interesting scene. And just to give you an example, you can see that that's playing back at a reasonable speed. This is where our proxies really come in to be handy. If we rewind to the beginning, let's just switch that to the high-res version and press play. Hopefully you can see that that's playing back considerably slower, and the more objects that become visible, the slower it will become. So it's slowing right down now. If we increase that count even more, then you know it's kind of exponential. Eventually it'll just be crawling along and it'll just switch to box mode. There we go. Switch to box mode at that point. If we just stop, press play, switch it back, press play, it's just going to play the whole way through with our proxy. We're not going to have any problems at all. So everything's going to be quicker. You're going to get a playback, better playback. All in all, just make your workflow a bit quicker. The last thing I'd like to do this week is to just animate our kind of boxing rig that we created last week. Now, it's going to be a bit destructive, smashing into these toys, but hopefully it will create a little bit more interest in the motion, and it will create a blockage, and then it will push them along, just create a little bit more interaction. Imagine that this kind of thing, if it was a real job, would be part of a much more complex setup, and there'd be all sorts of quirky elements such as this. You know, you could have like the kind of plunger that you get on a pinball machine, or you could have like the paddles on a pinball machine, or you could have you know, like a fan that spins around that allows them to go through, or like a water wheel that they catch on, or you could have a conveyor belts, all sorts of stuff. It could be a really interesting structure that you focus on different parts and then eventually pull back and reveal the logo. And this is obviously a much simpler version, just to demonstrate some of the ideas. So what I'm going to do is switch to my front view. Let's come in here and grab this sphere, rewind to frame 0. Because we've set this up as an IK rig, we can pull this backwards and forwards. Let's just hide our background image for a moment to make things a bit clearer. Okay, so let's select that sphere, switch to the coordinates tab. I'm going to set that to be 200. Let's add a key on frame 0. And let's come to, say, frame 25. And let's pull this back a bit more. I'm going to hold down Shift, take it to, say, 150. Jump forward 5 frames. Now let's pull this right across. Say, something like that. Let's add a key. Come forward another 5 frames. Let's just push that back very slightly. Just sort of add a little bit of fake inertia. Go forward another 5, and let's just pull it forward a tiny bit, like so. So now if we come forward to, say, frame 70, and what I want to do here is, let's just zoom in so we can see these keys a bit more clearly. Let's grab this very first key, control drag across to here. So at that point we're back at the beginning again. So now if we rewind and press play, you see we have this. I think maybe it goes a bit far because the actual concertina comes apart there. So let's control space with that selected to bring up the keys here. Very small F-curve manager because of this small capture area. First of all, let's take this key and get rid of that overshoot. And maybe let's pull these down a little bit. Okay, so we're getting a slightly strange effect there as the IK isn't responding quick enough. So I'm going to just move that forward a little bit so that it's not quite so fast. There we go. Now let's select that track, and if we come up to the attribute manager for the after value, we can just choose repeat, and let's just set that to, say, 100. And now when we press play, it's going to just repeat the same action. Of course, at the moment it's not having any effect on these objects because this sphere is not a dynamic object, but if we right click, choose simulation tags and choose collider body, now that's going to hit those objects. You can see we get this kind of strange smack effect as it hits the... It's not really pushing them along too much, but it's quite interesting. And I was thinking the motto for this toy company could be something like, we break your toys before you do. Because really a toy company isn't going to be wanting to break their toys, are they? But as I say, it's just a theory, this piece, and hopefully these kind of quirky little things give you some ideas of how you could use those in your own projects. So that's most of the animation done. There are a few more things to do, but we're going to tackle that next week. And next week we're going to take a look at some lights, creating textures for all of this, and hopefully end up with a finished project. So I hope you enjoyed it this week. Thanks very much for watching. Any questions, as usual, post them on the forums. If you are making progress and you've done anything of your own that you want to show, then please post your work. Love to see it. Other than that, have a great week and see you all next time. Thank you.